Good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a really enjoyable day today. I'm working on my Katie's Cap from Shetland Wool Week, and I came up with a great idea for another tip video. Here I'm working on the 7th hat from this pattern, and I've noticed there's a recurring theme with my knitting. And if you follow the Katie's Cap hashtag on Instagram, what I've found is that a lot of other people are running into this same issue. So I finally figured out what's going on and how to correct for it. I haven't knit in a really long time, so this is something that I remembered learning, but it had been forgotten. So here I am, relearning the same mistake. I thought I'd put a video out on it for everybody. So what's happening in this design is that there are single color rows throughout the pattern, and if you're not careful, it can create some rippling in your knitted fabric. It doesn't show up as much in this hat, but you can see it here where I have this is single row of brown and 2 single rows of white, and I didn't knit in these single rows firmly enough, and that's what happened. And then when I went up to this motif, you can see I'm going from single color rows where I didn't knit as firmly as I should have, and then all these single color areas in here also contributed to that rippling. And the reason why this is happening is because when we knit with a single color, our gauge will be different than when we knit with two colors. So in order to compensate for that, you have to adjust how firmly or tightly you knit and how tightly you're tensioning your yarn on these single color rows here. I'll show you another hat that I worked on with different yarn, and you can see it's really noticeable in this hat. This is the Icicle 2 yarn, and another reason why it's rippling a lot here is because there's a row in here where you're dramatically increasing your stitches, and that row of dramatic increases is right on top of this tight corrugated ribbing. And then you've got all these areas where there's a lot of single color, and then in this circular design there's lots of areas where there's this just singular color, and so it doesn't show as much when you stretch it out and block it and wear it. But I just wanted to point it out in case it's something you wanted to work on with your knitting. With this design here, it's an interlocking design, so the fabric is very stable. There's a lot of stabilization in the knitting, so you don't have to worry about it. But it shows up in particular in this section where you have these circular motifs that are not interspersed with peries, which are these small little, you can call them motifs. Sometimes they're 4-stitch motifs, 1-stitch motif. So they're supposed to be between sections so you have a more stable fabric. So this area here, I didn't find that it was an issue, but with these circular areas here, preceding and following these large sections of plain color knitting, the rippling starts showing. So I was able to avoid that finally with this one because I became very mindful of how tightly I was knitting with the yarn. So the way I firm up my gauge in those single color rows is, depending on the yarn I'm using, I will just wrap the yarn around my finger twice. And in the case of this Icicle yarn, which is very slippery, especially against these metallic needles, I had to wrap the yarn around my finger 3 times. And the other way you can deal with that issue is, for example, with this Icicle yarn, it's very slippery with these metallic needles. So you can switch to wooden needles, and that'll put more friction between slippery yarn. When you're knitting with more slippery yarn, you want to knit with a needle that gives you a bit more friction, and that will help you get a more even gauge. If it's too slippery yarn, slippery needles, it's really difficult to tension your knitting so that you get a nice, even, smooth, finished appearance here. So I love this Icicle yarn, but I don't like the way my knitting is showing up. So I ordered a pair of wooden circular needles, and I'm hoping to try this again and see if I can get better results. So the final way that you can cope with tensioning your yarn is there are sections of this pattern where you have large sections of stitches. Here, I'll show you right here. So in between these motifs, there's actually 7 stitches of the background color, and because my right hand is dominant, I'll make sure I switch the yarn so that I knit this row with the background color in my right hand, even though I normally knit the background color with my left hand. And that is how I was able to make sure that the knitting was not going to get wonky when I did that section. So you can see that 7 stitch area right here. So normally what you want to do is knit your entire project with the foreground color in the same hand and the background color in the same hand. And that's related to an issue called yarn dominance. If you knit more loosely with one hand compared to the other, then the looser, the hand that you knit the looser stitches with, that color will appear more prominent, and the other color will recede. And so if you switch which yarn you hold in each hand midstream, you might end up with a wonky looking knitted area because your gauge will again change. So normally I don't recommend that, but for that one row I went ahead and switched because I knew that I needed it to get firmer, and I didn't get that uneven look just by switching which hand I held in which color. So you can see here, even though I was very mindful of how firmly I was knitting, it still has a bit of wonkiness, but it disappears once you put the hat on or block it. It's not that prominent, but it definitely shows up here. So I thought I would just mention that, and I hope that this tip turns out to be really useful when you're working on any kind of pattern that gives you a motif like this, where there's large sections without a lot of pieris to stabilize that fabric, or where there's lots of single color rows here. You just have to be extra mindful of knitting much more firmly, whatever technique that you use that is going to get you there. And lots and lots of Norwegian or Swedish or Scandinavian designs have lots of single color rows and big sections between motifs that tend to just have large areas of single colors. And the knitters from that area of the world are very masterful at learning how to tension their yarn so that they still end up with a nice even fabric. But it's how they do that is never incorporated into the pattern. You're just supposed to kind of know on your own. So if you're just getting started and you fall in love with the pattern and you see that the pattern has a lot of single color areas, this is a great tip so that you can kind of know in advance rather than figuring it out as you work through and then have to rip back. So I hope this tip is really helpful in case you're interested in the yarn I'm working with. It's the Lichen and Lace sock weight yarn 80/20, and these are the colors here. Really beautiful fall colors. And if anybody's interested, let me know if you want to know what colors these are, and I'll respond to the comment section below. So thank you so much for watching, you guys, and I'll see you next time. Have a great weekend.